I used to believe that some bonds were unbreakable, that when you build something strong enough, whether it's friendship, love, or even a business, it could withstand anything. I was wrong. Jason, Olga, and I had been inseparable since childhood. The kind of trio that everyone knew by name, always together, always a team. We had grown up on the same street, played the same games, dreamed the same dreams. Even as kids, we knew that life had something big in store for us. Then we grew up, and life made its choices. Jason and I both fell for Olga, and for a while it seemed like the perfect storm, something that could tear us apart. But Olga chose me. She said it had always been me. Jason, he took it well. Or at least he pretended to. He never let it show, never turned bitter. He was at our wedding, standing beside me as my best man, toasting to our happiness. He said we were family, that nothing could change that. And for years I believed him. Together, we built something incredible. What started as a small venture between three childhood friends turned into a thriving business, one that demanded everything we had. We each handled a different piece of the puzzle, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Jason, pragmatic and ruthless in negotiations. Olga, brilliant and sharp, overseeing our legal and financial strategies. And me? I kept it all. Together, the glue that held our empire intact. Life was good. More than good. It was perfect. When Olga told me she was pregnant, I thought my heart might explode. It was the kind of happiness that people spend their whole lives searching for, and I had it right there in my hands. Jason was thrilled for us, or at least that's what he said. He was there for every milestone, every checkup. He threw us. A surprise baby shower, went with Olga to prenatal classes when I couldn't make it. He was our rock. Then our son was born, and that's when things changed. The first time I held him, I felt an overwhelming sense of love and responsibility. He was beautiful. Perfect little fingers, soft skin, and the brightest blue eyes. And his hair. Golden blonde, just like Olga's. I laughed, telling her he was her spitting image. But when I looked up at Jason, something flickered in his expression. It was gone so fast I almost missed it. Not sadness, not jealousy, something else. I tried to brush it off. Jason was still Jason, still my best friend, still Uncle Jason to our newborn son. But looking back, that was the first moment. The first time I felt that itch at the back of my mind, the sense that something wasn't right. I just didn't know it yet. A few months passed in a blur of sleepless nights, baby cries, and stolen moments of peace. Olga was exhausted, and I did my best to be there, but the company was going through a rough patch. A critical contract fell through, and suddenly I was needed more at work than ever before. Jason stepped up. He was always there, helping Olga, bringing her food, holding the baby while she napped. He reassured me constantly. "I've got this, Mike. You take care of the company. I'll take care of them." At first I was grateful, but as the weeks went by, that unease started creeping in again. Jason knew things about Olga that I didn't. Small things, details I should have known as her husband. What she was craving. The exact hours she was waking up with the baby. When she needed space, when she wanted company. He was always one step ahead of me. Then came the moments that were harder to ignore. A lingering touch when he handed her something. The way he looked at her when he thought I wasn't watching. Conversations that abruptly stopped when I walked into the room. I told myself I was imagining it. That Jason was just being a good friend, a good uncle. But the seed was planted, and once it was there, it started to grow, and then came the worst day of my life. It happened without warning. One minute I was at work, trying to fix yet another mess in our supply chain, and the next, the police were swarming my office. Before I could process what was happening, I was in handcuffs, being dragged into the back of a squad car. I was being charged with negligence leading to the death of one of our workers. I barely registered what they were saying. My mind was racing, trying to piece together how this could have happened. The company had strict safety protocols. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And yet, the evidence was stacked against me. Documents with my signature approving faulty equipment. Emails traced back to my account. It was a setup. But by who? At first, I expected Jason and Olga to be there, to fight for me, to stand by my side. Jason was the only one who showed up just once, telling me to stay strong, that they were working on it. Then he disappeared. No calls, no messages, no visits. I reached out to Olga through my lawyer, but she didn't respond. Days passed, and the silence became deafening. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, and I had no idea that the worst was yet to come. Jail does something to a man. It stretches time, twists it, makes every second feel like an eternity. I had never been a prisoner before. Never imagined I would be. But there I was, locked away, alone with my thoughts, forced to dissect my life piece by piece. And the more I thought, the more the cracks in my reality widened. At first I told myself there had to be a mistake, that Olga hadn't come because she was overwhelmed, that Jason was working behind the scenes to get me out, that everything would make sense once I was free. But the days passed, and the silence grew heavier. Jason had come once, just once. He sat across from me in the visitor's room, his expression carefully controlled. He told me to stay strong, that he was handling things. Then he left, and after that, nothing. No calls, no updates, no messages from Olga. I called my lawyer, demanding to know if anyone had been in contact. He hesitated. Jason assured me he was taking care of things on your behalf, he said. Jason. Again. That's when the first sharp pang of doubt cut through me. My business was in chaos, my reputation being dragged through the mud, and Jason was the only one standing to gain from it. The betrayal sat in my gut like poison, but I couldn't let it consume me. Not yet, because I needed to get out first. Made bail 3 days later. The moment I stepped outside the station, the air felt different. Tainted. Wrong. I gripped the bundle of paperwork my lawyer handed me, barely hearing his reassurances as I climbed into the cab. There was only one place I wanted to be. Home. With Olga. With my son. But the moment I pushed open the front door, I knew. This wasn't home anymore. The house was too still, too silent. Normally, the soft hum of music played from the kitchen, or I'd hear the faint sound of my son's laughter. But now, only the distant ticking of a clock filled the space. And then, voices, hushed, intimate, coming from the bedroom. My breath caught. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was standing in the hallway, my body rigid, my pulse hammering in my ears. The bedroom door wasn't fully shut. A thin sliver of light seeped through the crack, casting a faint glow against the darkened corridor. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Through the narrow gap, I saw them, Olga and Jason, their bodies tangled together in the sheets that had once been ours. Jason's hands on her skin, her fingers digging into his back, their whispers thick with something that made my stomach turn. The air left my lungs in a sharp, silent gasp. Everything inside me froze, the world narrowing to that single gut-wrenching image. But it wasn't just what they were doing. It was what Jason said next that shattered me completely. Once Mike is locked up for good, we can finally live as a family. Just us. And our son. Our son. I stumbled back, gripping the wall as bile rose in my throat. My son. Mine. But was he? The blonde hair, the blue eyes, the way Jason had always been too involved, too eager to play the role of protector. The puzzle. Pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. This wasn't a moment of weakness between them. It wasn't just some affair. This had been planned. From the start. I don't know how long I stood there. How long I let my mind spiral into the depths of realization. I only know that when I finally moved, I didn't go into that room. I didn't scream. I didn't break down. I walked out. My legs carried me to my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rage burned inside me, red-hot and suffocating, but I couldn't let it consume me. Not yet. Because if I confronted them now, I'd lose. They had already set their trap. They wanted me locked away. They wanted me out of the picture. But I wasn't going to be their victim. I checked into a hotel that night, staring blankly at the ceiling as my mind raced through every detail, every sign I had ignored. The way Jason had been there for every step of Olga's pregnancy. The way he always seemed to know things before I did. The way my company, my life, had started crumbling at the exact moment their perfect little family could be formed. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a goddamn execution, and they thought I was already dead. By the next morning, I had a plan. Wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. That would be too easy for them. They had spent months, maybe years, orchestrating this, and I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Instead, I made a call. Not to Olga, not to Jason, to my lawyer, and then to the people who were still loyal to me. The ones Jason had underestimated. The ones who could help me burn everything they had built together to the ground. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. They thought I was buried. Jason and Olga believed I was still locked away, drowning under false charges, powerless to fight back. They had no idea that the man they tried to destroy was quietly pulling every string, watching them from the shadows. But I wasn't just watching, I was preparing. The first thing I did was go after the one thing Jason cared about more than Olga: control. My company, the empire we built together, had been bleeding out ever since my arrest. Jason had positioned himself as the savior, stepping in as the face of leadership, reassuring investors while working behind the scenes to cut me out completely. But he had gotten sloppy. In his rush to seize everything, he left a trail, a very obvious trail. With the help of a forensic accountant, someone Jason didn't even know existed, I uncovered what he'd been doing. Fraud, embezzlement, financial manipulation. Jason hadn't just framed me for the worker's death, he had been siphoning money for years, using shell accounts to cover his tracks. And now I had proof. The worker's death? It was no accident. The equipment failure had been orchestrated, the documents altered, all signed off by Jason. Everything he had done to frame me was now sitting neatly in a folder, waiting to be used. I had the evidence. Now, I just needed to make my move, unmasking the villains. Jason and Olga didn't know I had been released on bail. They thought they had more time to enjoy their stolen life, more time to build their fantasy. I let them believe that. For 3 days, I stayed silent, watching them from a distance. Jason had moved into my house. He walked through those doors like he belonged. There, slept in my bed, held my son as if he were his own. They lived their lives in the open, never once suspecting that I was one step ahead of them. And then, when I was ready, I walked through that door. The ultimate confrontation. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. I simply stepped inside and let the sound of my footsteps echo through the house. Olga was in the living room, curled up on the couch, sipping a glass of wine. Jason sat beside her, their laughter dying the moment they saw me. For the first time, they looked afraid. "Mike," Olga whispered, eyes widening. "You're not in jail?" I finished for her, my voice eerily calm. Jason shot up from the couch, masking his panic with forced authority. "You shouldn't be here." I laughed. Actually laughed. The sound made Olga flinch. "This is my house, Jason," I said, stepping closer. "Or did you forget that in the middle of playing house with my wife?" Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Olga had the decency to look ashamed. But Jason? He was calculating, trying to figure out if I knew. I made it easy for him. Without a word, I pulled a thick envelope from my coat and tossed it onto the coffee table. Jason frowned, hesitating before picking it up. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the documents, and then he turned pale. "Divorce papers," I said, looking straight at Olga. "You'll sign them, today." She swallowed hard. "Mike, please." "I'm not done," I cut her off. Jason was still staring at the paperwork, his hands trembling. "Say goodbye to the father of your child," I told Olga, my voice sharp as glass. She blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" I leaned in, close enough to see the exact moment realization dawned on her. "Jason," I murmured. Shouldn't you tell her? Her head snapped toward him. Tell me what? Jason clenched his jaw, his eyes flickering with something dangerous. He's bluffing, he muttered. I smiled. Am I? I pulled out my phone, tapping the screen. Within seconds, the television lit up, showing the neatly compiled evidence I had gathered. Financial fraud, conspiracy, the setup, every dirty move Jason had made. But the real bombshell? The DNA results. I watched as Olga's face drained of all color. Your son, I said softly, isn't mine. Her breath hitched. Jason turned to her, his expression unreadable. And that's when I saw it. For all his arrogance, for all his careful planning, Jason had never told her the truth. He thought. She knew. She didn't, and now. She looked like she wanted to vomit. Before either of them could recover, sirens wailed outside. Jason turned to me, his expression shifting from shock to fury. You bastard! I just smiled. You set me up, he spat. I tilted my head. Like, you did to me? The front door burst open. Officers stormed inside, guns drawn. Jason barely had time to react before they tackled him to the ground. Jason Carter, one of the officers said, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and negligent homicide. Jason thrashed, yelling protests. But it didn't matter. It was over. Olga was next. She stood frozen as the officers turned to her, reading her rights. Please, she whimpered, looking at me with wide, desperate eyes. Mike, don't do this. I didn't know. I let out a slow, deliberate breath. That's the problem, Olga, I said quietly. You should have. As they cuffed her, she sobbed. I didn't feel anything. As they dragged Jason and Olga toward the door, I called out. Wait. The officers paused. I turned to Olga, meeting her tear-filled gaze. You have a choice, I told her, my voice devoid of warmth. Let our son stay legally mine, or fight for him from behind bars. Her breath hitched. Mike. You wanted Jason? I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. Now you have him, but my son stays with me. She choked on a sob. Walked to the front door, watching as they were shoved into separate squad cars. Jason's glare burned into me, filled with rage, with hatred, but I didn't care. Because now, I had won. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse, journalists scrambling to cover the scandal. Betrayal. Fraud. Murder. The story had everything they loved. But for me, this wasn't about headlines. This was about justice. Jason sat at the defendant's table, dressed in a cheap suit, his once confident expression replaced with something colder. Olga sat beside him, her face pale, hands trembling slightly as she refused to meet my gaze. They were both guilty, and today, the world would know it. The prosecution tore them apart. Evidence after evidence. Financial fraud, manipulation, the setup. The altered documents Jason had used to frame me for the worker's death, the hidden accounts, the recorded conversations, the DNA test proving what neither of them had ever admitted out loud. Olga tried to paint herself as an unwitting victim, claiming Jason had orchestrated everything, that she had been blind to his crimes. Jason, in contrast, sat stone-faced, refusing to acknowledge the mountain of evidence against him. But the jury wasn't stupid. Neither was the judge. When I took the stand, I told my story. Every single detail, how Jason and I had built a company together, how we had been friends since childhood, how he had smiled at me on my wedding day, shaken my hand, promised me loyalty, while secretly plotting my downfall. How Olga had once told me she loved me, that I was the only one while carrying Jason's child. I spoke calmly, without emotion. But the weight of it all, the betrayal, the destruction, the lies, hung heavy in the courtroom. When I stepped down from the stand, neither of them could look at me. And then the verdict came. Guilty. On all counts, they were sentenced to 20 years, each. I didn't stay to watch them being taken away. I had no interest in their final expressions, in whatever last words they might have wanted to say. I walked out of that courtroom and into a new life. Securing full custody of my son was easier than expected. Olga knew she didn't stand a chance. She had signed away her rights in exchange for a slightly more lenient sentence. It wasn't about love for her. It never had been. But for me, it was everything. I wasn't his biological father. But I was the only father he had ever known, and I would be damned if I let Jason Carter take anything else from me. The letter arrived 3 months later. A thick envelope, my name scrawled in Jason's handwriting across the front. I stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. Inside, pages upon pages of his words. Regret. Excuses, please. Jason begged for my forgiveness. He claimed Olga had manipulated him, that it hadn't been about revenge, not at first, that he had been jealous of me, of the life I had, of the love I had with Olga, that he had convinced himself I didn't deserve it, and when Olga finally gave in to him, he had gone too far. By the time he realized it, he was too deep in his own lies to stop. He wrote about his son, the son he would never see grow up. He begged me to take care of him, to be the father he never could. I read the letter twice, then I burned it. Jason had spent years planning my downfall, destroying everything I had built, stealing the family that was supposed to be mine. He didn't deserve forgiveness. It was a cool autumn morning. I stood in the park watching my son chase after a group of pigeons, his laughter echoing through the crisp air. He had no idea what had happened. No idea that the people who had brought him into this world had also destroyed each other, and I planned to keep it that way. I had spent so long drowning in anger, betrayal, grief. But standing there, watching my son, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. I had survived. But more than that, I had won.